So I'm in medical school, and every mentor that I've ever had has given me this same tired analogy of medical education is like drinking from a fire hose. And now that I'm actually here, I can say that they're right. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I organize my studying to help me learn over 1,000 facts every single day. Now, most of my experience with education revolves around physics, I guess now medicine, and then standardized testing. A lot of you watching this video probably know me as an MCAT tutor. But the material in this video specifically should be applicable to most fields of study. Now that's especially true if the most difficult portion of that field of study is just the sheer mass of the content that you have to learn rather than how difficult it is. Now, just like most things in life, the most difficult portion of my studying process is in the setup and planning. And once you've done that, then the rest is all about just showing up every single day and getting the job done. But to make it a little bit easier to understand and easy to apply, I'm gonna walk you through the 3 steps that I use for studying and then quickly show you how to fit that into your schedule. The first step, whenever you're trying to learn a new concept or maybe a new PowerPoint slide or lecture, the first thing that you're gonna have to do is actually understand the big picture, like the concepts. And the scientific literature around memory and learning calls this encoding. And it's definitely the most cognitively taxing portion of the job. And this is what most people are trying to do whenever they're like scrolling through PowerPoints or reading a textbook or even watching a lecture. That's the general idea behind it, is I'm supposed to understand the big picture concepts. A lot of people kind of get bogged down whenever they're in lecture, especially by trying to memorize the tiny details the first time you go through it, but that is not the goal. The science behind how our brain actually encodes this material isn't really important for you to be able to apply it, but if you're just curious how it works, then I will throw some links in the description for you to read up a little bit more about it. But it deals with things like action potentials, neuronal pruning, using neurotransmitters to strengthen and weaken synapses. It really is all just about like chemicals and electricity in your brain. But again, I'll leave a link that's going to explain it a little bit better than I will. Now, the process of encoding may look a little bit different for you than it does for me, but the goal is absolutely identical. Understand the big picture concepts. Now, in order to do this, you have to actually interact with material to where you can fully understand it or at least grasp it 90% of the way. There's a couple good ways to test whether or not you've actually have grasped this concept, but the best one is probably the Feynman technique. And there's several people that have made videos on the Feynman technique, from people like Sprouts and Med School Insiders, all the way to individual YouTubers like Thomas Frank and Zach Hiley are a couple I can think of. So I'm not gonna belabor the idea of the Feynman technique because I'm not as good as they are, but it's basically the idea that in order to prove that you have mastered a concept, you should teach it in a simple way. Now, you can teach it to a friend, but I usually honestly just kind of teach it to myself like a weirdo, just mutter it under my breath or pace around the room teaching it to myself. But you want to understand it well enough to explain it, and you want to condense it down and down so that you can teach it. The goal is to be able to explain something to a younger audience. The goal of the Feynman technique is to be able to explain it to the youngest audience that you can without losing too much of the details that actually makes it the science that you're explaining. And that concept of like reducing the age that can understand what you're talking about is where that famous Einstein quote came from that says, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. Or a 5-year-old if you're Michael Scott.
Okay.
We have to spend that by the end of the day or it will be deducted from next year's budget.
Why don't you explain this to me like I'm 5?
Now, another really great way to learn material, which is what I usually do for med school, is to categorize and summarize. Now, this is something that I do every single day when I sit down to learn about diseases or different medications or even concepts like physiology. And summarizing your material also makes the next step, which is arguably the most important, a whole lot easier. So that's definitely my go-to, and you'll see why in just a minute. So the first step is to just purely learn the material. Now, you can do that however you see best, whether it be reading the book or going through PowerPoints or drawing it out on a whiteboard. And I've done all those and they've all worked pretty well. But it's really important to do it as early as you can so that you can move on to the next step of the process. And that typically means don't cram the night before the exam. That's a different video. I guess I can make that video too. Review. review. It's not as sexy as you thought it would be, but it's also more important than you think it would be. And there are several things that I do to make it more enjoyable and, more importantly, easier. If you're learning for a career like medicine or law or honestly any other field of study where it's important that you memorize or you retain the material for longer than like the 48 hours it takes you to cram and take the test, then reviewing what you've learned is substantially more important than cramming down another PowerPoint into your brain. And that's because if you were learning a new PowerPoint at the expense of forgetting the 2 or 3 that you learned yesterday, then you are not actually making a net gain. You're not getting the most out of your education. And the reality of memories and learning is that memories are always at like a constant rate of decay. The strength of a memory after we learn something is constantly dwindling if we don't re-strengthen that memory. And you don't have to take my word for it. This memory decay chart, which has been around for over 100 years, proves it. In order to keep a memory at conscious recall, you have to review that material. But also, you've got to be able to do that quickly and in a way where you're not studying 1,000 things that you already know, because that's also a little bit of a waste of time. Now, the way that I do this is with a flashcard app called Anki, and I owe my firstborn child to the developers of Anki because it has completely changed the way that I've studied, and it's allowed me to do really well in school, but also do things like manage this YouTube channel, enjoy things like playing basketball, and also manage my relationships. Now, in medical education, there are entire ecosystems dedicated to using Anki to study and learn medicine that you will remember throughout your entire career as a physician. And that's supported by free decks, third-party resources which I use all the time, like Amboss and Boards and Beyond. I use all those things, and even like Reddit support threads that help you troubleshoot some of the more techie sides of things, which I also use because I'm not very techie. And I've actually found a lot of pre-made decks for subjects outside of sciences, but there's a decent chance that what you're trying to learn won't have an ecosystem that is as well fleshed out as medicines. But that's completely fine because you can either make your own cards, build a deck with a friend group, or just use an entirely different method. You don't have to use Anki to be successful. And to prove that, another really great way to review topics quickly that I still use is through one-page summary sheets. Now, for these sheets, I put a heavy emphasis on lists, mnemonics, exceptions to rules, and figures. So whenever I'm reviewing a lecture or a single PowerPoint, I like to go through and make sure that I pull out those 4 things from a PowerPoint and have them on a one-page review sheet. I try not to go too far over 1 page because it forces me to condense down the material. So I want to make sure that I pull out the relevant concepts and the nitty-gritty things that are going to be tested, because that's usually what they end up testing, right? But I also want to learn the concept while I'm reading through the PowerPoint, and I want my review material to be small enough and limited enough that I can quickly look over a page in 15 minutes before I start my studying and have everything reviewed from the day before. That's really important. Now, the nitty-gritty testable things that are usually going to be asked on a test, they're usually denoted by some form of fashion of like bolded font or repetition. That's a big one. If they say it like 6 times in a lecture, they have like 3 slides on it and then it appears later in the lecture, they're gonna test you on it. Or if they include like a figure or 2 that's trying to illustrate a point that they just talked you through, they're gonna test you on it. So things like that need to be clipped and put into your one-page review sheet. And I use Notability to help me do this so that I can do it a little bit quicker. But again, it's important to keep those sheets to a 1-page maximum because it forces you to condense and prioritize the material that you think and have deemed as high yield. Now, a lot of our lectures, which are 1-hour lectures, have over 100 slides in them. And so I'm condensing them down pretty heavily. And to make my life easier whenever I'm reviewing these sheets, every time I write down like a little fact that I need to remember, I'll write the slide number out beside it or like the book page number and go ahead and circle it. So I know where to return if I need to access it later. But regardless how you review, you've got to do it early and you've got to do it often. And it's also a really time-consuming process to review. So make sure you're doing something like Anki or review sheets to speed up the process, because rereading through PowerPoint several times is just a waste of time. Combining those 2 methods usually lets me knock out everything I've been studying for a block, which is about 4 to 6 weeks in school, in 2 hours that morning. So after reviewing, encoding, and condensing my material, I'm usually well over 1,000 facts for the day. But this video would be completely incomplete if I did not talk to you about testing. You've got to take practice tests to mature the knowledge that you've gained. If you don't force yourself to apply the knowledge before you actually take the real exam, then you're gonna realize on that exam that your understanding of some concepts is not necessarily mature. And that's why you've gone into a test before and you felt like you know everything, and then you walk out with like an 85 and you're like, what the heck happened? And the reason that happens is because when we learn material, our brain takes shortcuts and it makes these schemas. So whether or not you are cognitively condensing material on purpose, your brain's doing it for you. And that's really great because it allows us to learn material really quickly and to store a ton of material into our brains. But it's also kind of bad because it leads us into this like false sense of confidence about what we actually do know. And testing yourself on that topic is the ultimate way to cover that blind spot. Now, the hardest part about testing is actually finding materials to test yourself with. And I was never a guy in undergraduate that had access to like test banks or anything like that. So I usually relied on pulling material from like in-class quizzes or the back of textbooks, which is really the only reason I ever used a textbook. Now, if you're in medical school or you are studying for the MCAT, then there are third-party resources that have dedicated several $1,000,000 to providing you with realistic practice questions. And I can only imagine that those are there for other fields like accounting or engineering or law. But if you're studying for something a little bit more general education like physics or gen chem, especially math, then you're gonna wanna look in the back of the book. Those end of the chapter quizzes are great, and your teachers are reading them whenever they write questions. They're not standing up there on syllabus day and praising this one specific book for no reason. And if your book doesn't have any, or there don't seem to be any that are matching up with the material that you're studying, then ask your professor where you can find some questions, ask a TA, ask friends or SI leaders, and if you have to, then just Google questions. I mean, you can type in the subject that you're studying and say, questions on Le Chatelier's principle, and there will be questions that pop up for you. Now, when you take these questions and it kind of like molds the way you view a topic, it's really important that you go back and you change your review source, whether it be Anki or your one-page summary, to line up with this new understanding of that concept. And it's really important to mention that everybody hates writing practice questions, including your teachers. So if, again, they are praising one textbook and saying that you should work questions from it, then they're more than likely either pulling questions directly from it, or they are rewording those questions slightly, because writing a good question is actually pretty difficult. You can really take advantage of that by studying around the question, meaning once you take a practice question, it's really important that you know what they're asking, why the correct answer is correct, why the incorrect answers are incorrect, and how could you change the question to make the incorrect answers be the right answer. Because a good test question, the wrong answer choices are usually correct about another fact. So figure out how they could change the question's stem to make the wrong answer the right answer, and that's a great way to study. Learning, reviewing, and testing, these 3 steps are what I use every single day to make sure that I learn over 1,000 facts every day, except for the weekends, I don't like that, and make sure that I can apply them in exams and hopefully in later life as a physician. As far as my scheduling goes, I usually start my studying between 6 or 7 a.m. and I review for a couple of hours until it's done, and then I will learn new lectures by going through the PowerPoints, drawing them out, making my summary sheets until about 4 p.m. and then I'll take some practice questions for about an hour. Then I usually call it a day. Now, it might take some experimenting for you to figure out how this material works best for you, but when you do, come back on this video and tell me, what are your favorite ways to encode? What are your favorite ways to review? Because I'd like to learn from you as much as I want you to learn from me. Thanks for watching the video. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.